Hello, everybody, and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. In today's talk, I was going to talk about lunar yogas, and there are many. And actually, a lot of yogas can be taken from the moon as well as the Lagna, the rising sign or ascendant. So there's some specific ones in this talk that are what are called lunar yogas. So anyway, we'll go through them. The main ones are Sunapha, Anapha, Dhuradhara, and Kemadruma. And again, this is all from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective, so ancient Indian astrology. Okay, if you're new to Vedic astrology or Jyotish or my videos, all my teaching videos on the subject or my concepts playlist, they can be found there. And wherever you see a double asterisk in one of my talks, it means I have a teaching video on that topic, so you can learn more about it. And for similar content like this, I would look at my Yoga's Planetary Combinations playlist. And probably the most closely related to this one is the solar yogas, Vesi, Vasi, and Ubhayachari. There's differences for sure. So, but there's some similarities, some differences. So you can compare and contrast. So other videos to watch before this one or with this one to get more out of this talk, more North, South, and East Indian style charts. I do cover Western style charts in that video as well. Introduction to navigating a birth chart. The Lagna, also known as the Ascendant, rising sign of first house. Natural benefic and malefic planets. Planet friends and enemies or Mitra Shatru. Planet exaltation, debilitation or Ucha Nicha. And then symbolism of the moon or Chandra. Okay, so what is a lunar yoga? So lunar refers to the moon, and yoga, at least as Vedic astrology is concerned, is a planetary combination. So when you get certain planets in combination with each other in certain positions, it can form a yoga. And yoga gives kind of extra kind of it's more of a meta-analysis type thing. Sometimes or often the yogas are very powerful or can be very powerful, and they might kind of supersede just general placements of planets in the chart. So there's a sort of like, especially when they're very strong yogas, it can give kind of like an X factor. Okay. So let's talk about the lunar yogas. And again, it's not like a strict definition here, but these four that I'm going to list first on this slide are considered the main or most famous lunar yogas. Okay. There are other ones, and I'll get into some of the other ones. But again, most yogas are derived or analyzed from, or can be analyzed from the Lagna or rising sign ascendant. And they can also be found from the position of the moon. So the moon is very important in yogas. Right, but let's talk about these four first, and then we'll get into some other stuff. So the first one is Sunapha yoga. And the first three here are kind of similar to the solar yogas if you watch that video, in terms of like, what are we looking for? How are we going to identify that we have a lunar yoga? Okay. So the first one here is Sunapha yoga. And so this is when a true planet is in the second house or bhava from the moon, but there's no true planet in the 12th. And down below on the slide, I've listed the true planets in case you need a reminder. So Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn are true planets, but not Sun, Rahu, or Ketu, because Sun is a star and Rahu and Ketu are actually calculations. They're not like a planet with mass. Okay. So when we have a true planet, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, in the second house from the moon, then we have a Sunapha yoga. When we have a true planet, so one of those planets in the list, in the 12th house from the moon, but not the second, then we get Anapha yoga. And when we get true planets on both the second and the 12th house from the moon, we get a Dhuradhara yoga. Okay, so if we look at this chart on the right here, we have the moon in the 5th house, and it's in Scorpio. Okay, so again, if you're new here, I use North Indian style charts in my work, and to find the ascendant, Lagna, rising sign, first house, those are all different names for the same thing. You look at the diamond in the top of the chart, and in this chart, there's a little 4 in the corner. The 4 is not, it does not mean the fourth house. It's actually the first house, but the 4 represents the fourth constellation of the zodiac, which is Cancer or Karka in Sanskrit. Okay, so this is a Cancer rising chart. Okay, it just happens to be just for, example purposes. Okay, so we locate the moon, and in this chart, the moon is in the 5th house in Scorpio, where it's debilitated. So that, in and of itself, the fact the moon's debilitated here, will most likely, if there are any yogas associated with the moon, they may not be particularly strong, especially when you run into Shah or planetary period of the moon, because the moon is not very strong. So, okay, but what are we looking? We're looking at the 2nd house from the moon. So we go 1 house clockwise, and then the 12th house from the moon is 1 house counterclockwise. So if you look at the little circles I've placed here, if we have a Sunapha yoga, so a true planet in the 2nd house, then you would see a true planet where that blue circle is, and it's kind of circling a 9. That's Sagittarius, the next zodiac sign after Scorpio. But you wouldn't see anything in Libra. Okay. Then if you have an Anapha yoga where you have a true planet in the 12th house, then you would look for like the green circle in the 12th house from the moon. Then if you have true planets in both the 2nd and the 12th, then you would look at these orange circles in the 2nd and the 12th, and that would give you Dhuradhara yoga. Okay. Now, the 4th yoga is kind of like a negation or kind of a negative of these 3 yogas that I've mentioned so far. Okay, just again, we're just identifying here, and then I'll get into what this actually means, like in terms of interpretation. So the 4th one is a Kemadruma yoga. Okay, now there are various definitions of this. Okay, so the most simple definition is that there's no Sunapha, no Anapha, and no Dhuradhara yoga. So there are no true planets in either the 2nd or the 12th house from the moon. Okay. Now, there's usually like a little bit more criteria to make it more strict. Okay. So the additional criteria are there are no planets in Kendras from the moon. So Kendras are the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th house from the moon. Okay, so you got to look for that. And I would actually. That's what I do when I'm looking for a Kemadruma yoga. And the other thing is that there's no true planets in Kendras from the Lagna. So you got to look at Kendras from the moon and Kendras from the Lagna, and are there any true planets? Okay. Now we do not so Sun, Rahu, and Ketu I mentioned are not true planets. So if you have Sun, Rahu, and Ketu in the 2nd house or house of the moon or 12th house, that doesn't make the first 3 yogas because they're not true planets. But the other thing is you have Sun, Rahu, Ketu in the 2nd, 12th, or its own house of moon. It doesn't nullify the Kemadruma either. So you kind of, at least in the beginning, ignore Sun, Ketu, and Rahu. Because the thing is, when the Sun's very close to the moon is going to be new and it's going to be weak. And when you have Rahu and Ketu close to the moon, there's potentially like an eclipse coming. So that's also going to make the moon weak. Okay. So getting back to the Kemadruma. So you want to look at the Kendras from the moon. So again, that's 1, 4, 7, 10 houses from the moon. Then you want to look at Kendras, 1, 4, 7, 10 houses from the Lagna, the rising sign ascendant. And then the other thing is you want to see that the moon is not in a Kendra from the Lagna. So the moon is not in 1, 4, 7, or 10th house from the Lagna. Okay, so you don't have Sunapha, you don't have Anapha, you don't have Dhuradhara. So no true planets in the 2nd or 12th house from the moon. And then you want to check Kendras from the moon, from the Lagna, and then moon from the Lagna, essentially. Okay, so that's where I would start in terms of these 4. And again, these are the 4 most famous lunar yogas. Okay. Okay, so what does this all mean? Let's get into that. So the interpretation of lunar yogas, and this is from the Phala Deepika. So that's a book, one of the older books of interpretation, of teaching of Vedic astrology. And this is from chapter 6, and this is specifically the outcomes associated with Sunapha, Anapha, Dhuradhara, and Kemadruma yogas. Okay. So Sunapha, if you have a Sunapha yoga, so again, the true planet in the 2nd house or Bhava from the moon, but not in the 12th, The person will be a monarch, so somebody, of a lofty position or equal, have self-acquired property, and will be respected, renowned for intellect, and be rich. So a lot of good stuff can come from that. Okay. And then if somebody has an Anapha yoga, so again, a true planet in the 12th house from the moon, but not the second, they will be powerful, have good health, sweet temperament, be famous, have worldly comforts, be well dressed, happy, and content. Okay. Now the thing is, as I'm going through this all sounds like super great, but you have to, and I have the kind of disclaimer here at the end of the slide, is you need to consider the strength and nature and placement of all these planets to determine the overall effect. Okay, like in the slide before, the moon was in Scorpio, it's debilitated in Scorpio. So just that in of itself, regardless of where any other planets are, the moon is not going to give a lot, um, in terms of any yogas it's involved with. I mean, maybe it would give more if Mars was with it or aspecting Scorpio, because that would lift up and create a bunga, like kind of lessen the effects of the debilitation of moon. But still, you would not expect the moon to give a ton of yogas. Even if you've got like benefics all over and stuff like that, it just won't give as much. Okay. So, so then let's get back to, Sunapha sounds pretty good. Anapha sounds pretty good too. Dhuradhara here. I gotta make sure I have the spelling right on that. So if there's a true planet on both the second and 12th house or bhava from the moon, enjoy all the comforts of a ruler, wealth, vehicles, is generous, has faithful servants. That all sounds pretty good too. Now the Kemadruma, in contrast, so again, no true planets in the second or 12th house or bhava from the moon, and then you got to check Kendras from the moon, Kendra from the Lagna, and then if the moon is in a Kendra from the Lagna. So if somebody does have a Kemadruma, then even if they are a monarch, so even if they were born into wealth and an exalted family, they will become unknown and lead a miserable life, be addicted to immoral ways. They will experience poverty, and they will be wickedly disposed. Now, mind you, that this is all translated from ancient times and ancient language, and a lot of the words that are used are like quite. When you read them, it's like, wow, this is like really intense here. And part of that was because, again, Jyotish was originally taught, as an oral tradition. So to make the story or the information spicy or sticky in somebody's mind, they would use strong words and stuff like that. Okay. You can see Kemadruma is, and even if you start off with a lot of stuff, can like knock you down, essentially. Okay. Now, just as a reminder again, the true planets Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn. And when we're talking about yogas, so I have a video on planet friends and enemies. But I mentioned in that video that when we're assessing yogas, this is true. The natural malefics are Mars and Saturn of these five, and the natural benefics are Venus, Jupiter, and Mercury. Okay. Now, when we're just looking at their general placement in a chart, that's a little bit different. So just make sure you don't get confused there. Okay. This is specifically for yoga interpretation. Okay. Now, I have this chart that I wanted to include because this is a private or personal, chart here. Not anybody that's famous, but it's the clearest chart I have of a pretty clear Kemadruma. Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, let's find the moon first. The moon is in the 7th house in Pisces. The 12 represents the 12th constellation of Pisces. The moon is there. Okay. Now, do we have a Sunapha yoga? So if we look to the 2nd house from the moon, which would be Aries, do we have a true planet there? No, we have K2 there, but that's not a true planet. So no Sunapha. Okay. Then look for an Anapha. So let's see. Then we look at the 12th house from the moon. Do we have anything in the 12th house? We have nothing in the 12th house from the moon. So no Sunapha, no Anapha. Now, Dhuradhara would be a true planet in both the 2nd and the 12th house. So since we don't have Sunapha, since we don't have Anapha, we can't have a Dhuradhara. So initially, this might be a Kemadruma, okay? because we don't have true planets in the 2nd or 12th house from the moon. But let's check, okay? So we have to check the Kendras. So houses 1, 4, 7, 10 from the moon. Are there any planets in? So the 4th house from the moon would be the 10th house here of Gemini. No. 7th house from the moon would be the 1st house of Virgo. Do we have anything? No. Do we have anything in the 10th house from the moon, which would be the 4th house for the overall chart, which would be Sagittarius? No. So no planets in the Kendras from the moon. Okay, so that's not looking too good. Then do we have any planets, true planets, in the Kendras from the Lagna? Well, no, we don't. Because again, it's like the Lagna has nothing, the 4th house has nothing, the 12th house has the moon, but the moon's not a true planet either, because it's the moon. It's a moon, not a planet. And then the 10th house is nothing. So this is looking like a pretty strong, Kemadruma here. Then the last criteria, this is the only one that because the moon is in a Kendra from the Lagna, there's like a little bit of hope. But I would still consider this a very strong Kemadruma. I mean, this is an unusual, maybe if everything shifted, one house and the moon was in 6th or the 8th year, then then we would have a full, I think, Kemadruma, but it is what it is. Now, let's look at this chart for this person. I don't want to get too much into it, but that's not looking too great. So usually, again, so what does this all mean? I mean, why are we looking at the moon and why are we looking at planets, the moon, and stuff like that? Well, the thing is, it's like the moon represents the mind and the emotions and the, intuition, things like that. When we don't have true planets around the moon, it's like the moon is not supported. The moon is isolated. The moon also represents the public. So it's kind of like there's no outward support, public support, no material support, because then we're talking about true planets here. I mean, these are like the planets with mass. Okay. So, so a person with a Kemadruma yoga is going to feel isolated, but also usually be pretty isolated. Okay. Now, this person here, so, we have this, so we keep the Kemadruma in mind, but let's look at the rest of the chart to see, what's going on, just to give it, again, context, because you do want to do this in context. You just don't, like, run off and say, oh, this person has a Kemadruma, they're going to lose everything and, be wickedly disposed. That's just doesn't usually work like that, okay? So let's just look at this chart a little bit. So this is a Virgo rising chart, Virgo Lagna. 6th zodiac sign is Virgo or Kanya. Okay, now the Lagnatia, which is the ruling planet for Virgo, is Mercury, and Mercury has gone to the 2nd house. Okay, where it is with Sun, Rahu, and Mars. 3 malefics. That will make Mercury malefic as well. Okay. The other thing is that since you have Mars and Mercury, you don't have the degrees here, but Mars and Mercury are so close to the Sun that they're combust. That's going to make them weak. Okay. Then Sun is in a sign of debilitation. It's going to make it weak. Okay. Now, the other thing is that, even so, in a way, what that also means that this Sun and Mars and Mercury are going to aspect 2nd house from the moon into the 8th house of deep psychology. Okay. So the Sun is exalted in Aries, the 8th house. Mars is a Swa in its own sign in Aries. And then you have Mercury there with K2. Okay. You also have Saturn aspecting from the 11th house into Aries where it's debilitated. Okay. So already from this, just a little bit I've mentioned so far, this is somebody who's going to have, because the 2nd house represents speech, this is somebody who's often not going to be able to control what they say. And they're going to be fairly harsh and potentially deceptive in the things that they say. Okay. One, because Rahu, I've mentioned in my other videos, when you have Rahu or Ketu in the 2nd house, Rahu and Ketu, the north and south nodes of the moon, have this kind of hidden, unexpected quality. Okay. So And it's not always bad or malicious. So even though we're looking at, wickedly disposed here, the kind of outcome potentially with Kemadruma, you got to take everything with a grain of salt. So, but the thing is with Rahu and Ketu, you can get somebody who um, speaks in a way that doesn't reveal their true selves, and not necessarily in a malicious way. So this might be somebody who talks a good game, but doesn't have the, real credentials to back up what they say. You can also have somebody who is just very humble, and the way they talk, you would never know that they're very accomplished. So we have that, okay, both in the second house of, speech, and we have K2 in the eighth house of deep psychology. Then, in addition to that, you have Mars and Mercury together. So Mars can represent things like theft, and Mercury can represent speech and the mind. So sometimes when you get Mars and Mercury together, not always, you can get kind of a liar's combination. Okay, now we've got two of these going on, so we've got confluence here. The other thing is that the sun, which is a sattvic planet, so a planet that's high-minded, is debilitated. Okay, and then again, you have all of this, reflecting into the eighth house of psychology, where we have a very strong sun, a very strong Mars, because sun is exalted, Mars is Swa, Mercury there, but K2 is an explosive planet, and Sun and Mars are the leadership planets, but they're also very fiery. So deep in the psychology of this person, they're quite a fiery and destructive mind. Okay, and the way they speak, they may not show that. The other thing is that since Mars is combust here, so combustion or asta is when a true planet's so close to the sun that you can't see it anymore because it gets eclipsed by the light of the sun. And usually the qualities of that planet are not seen externally, but they are stronger internally. And Mars is a planet of rebellion, of anger, of irritation, of competition, of enemies. Okay, and then on top of all this, so there's a very strong desire to be in charge, but there's a lot of, again, chaotic, destructive energy in both the way that they speak and the way that they think. And you have the Saturn aspecting from the 11th house, creating more chaos because Saturn's debilitated in the eighth house. Okay. Now, so, is this person, living on the street or what? No, actually they're not. Okay. Actually, but the thing is, oh, I should mention that. So the second house also represents family. So you might think, again, just what we were talking about so far, that there's a lot of chaos and destruction in the family. And that was sort of true. But the thing is, you see the double-sided red arrow. Venus is in a sign of Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars. So Venus is in a sign of Mars, and Mars is in a sign of Venus. So there's a parivartana exchange of houses between Venus and Mars. So Venus coming into its own house will give a little bit of protection to the second house. But the thing is, when the Venus goes back to its own house, it will protect inanimate things, but it will not protect human beings associated with them. So this person did have a family, grew up with a family, but by the time they were a teenager, lost their mother. And by the time they were like mid-30s, lost their father, and then they had a sibling that they lost as well. Okay? Which also, like, Sun is not too surprising because Sun's debilitated. Sun represents father. Mars represents sibling, and Mars is combust. So you can see that there's a lot of issues here. Yeah. But the thing is, there will be some protection because you have this part of Arjun. So again, and that's another yoga. So you've got to start weaving the story together of the yogas and all the parts here. I mean, all the planets and placements. You got to read the whole thing. You can't just go Kemadruma. This has a very strong Kemadruma. Like, so just the fact that they basically lost their birth family by the time they were 35. I mean, that's a big loss there, and they're on their own, right? I mean, they don't have any other birth family around them. Um, Although this person did end up getting married and does have kids, so there are people around. So let's see a little bit why. So the reason why they might be married is because Moon is in Kendra. If Moon was in sixth house or eighth house or 12th house, maybe marriage wouldn't have happened. The other thing is if we look at the fifth house here, we have Mars aspecting the fifth house of Capricorn where it's exalted. We have Saturn aspecting the fifth house where it's Swa. We have Jupiter aspecting the fifth house where it's debilitated. So Jupiter, and Jupiter is actually strong because its disposer of Venus is aspecting that sign. So the Karaka, which is the planet symbol of children, is strong, even though Jupiter aspecting it, the Capricorn is not. But because Mars is exalted there and Saturn is Swa there, you would expect probably at least 2 kids, and they do have 2 kids. Okay. Now the other thing is that if we look at the Lagna, which is a Virgo Lagna, so this is a dual Earth sign. This is somebody who's going to, waver back and forth, be contradictory. And in addition to that, we have two planets that are contradictory in nature. We have Saturn aspecting the Lagna, which is like obstacles, delays, anxiety, skepticism, doubts. And then we have Jupiter aspecting here, which is optimism and generosity. So this is going to be a hard person to predict in terms of what they're going to do. Okay, now luckily Jupiter, at least Jupiter is aspecting the Lugna and Jupiter strong. So, there are times when this person is going to be generous. You just don't know, when and why or where. It's going to be hard to predict. The other saving grace, so I mentioned they did have marriage and they did have a couple kids. So again, they're not completely out there. They are also employed, and as you might, if you're used to assessing charts for profession, this person is a lawyer. So why might that be? Well, Jupiter is strong, and Jupiter is in the ninth house of higher education. You have Venus aspecting Jupiter, and Jupiter represents law. The other thing is that when you have this Venus-Mars Parivartan exchange of houses, Mars will be in the third house aspecting the ninth. So you basically have Jupiter in the ninth aspected by both Venus and Mars. When you have Mars and Jupiter together in any kind of profession house, that can indicate law because Mars is fighting and that sort of thing, and Jupiter is a law and also like oral speech. So this person had actually, you can see the two strongest houses, positive strong houses. Like actually, the fifth house is fairly strong because you have Mars um, exalted there and Saturn Swa there. And with Mars and Saturn together, the fifth house represents intellect besides children. When you have Mars and Saturn together, you're going to get somebody who's like an engineer. So somebody who's very, always constructing and analyzing, and all this Rahu, Sun, Mars mix in the second house. That's going to be a kind of a similar thing. So this is a very like sort of calculating type person, I would say. And with Jupiter debilitated in Capricorn, the way that they construct things, they're doing it without a lot of um, potentially a lot of compassion a lot of the time. Okay. So the intellect is strong in a way, but again, in a certain type of way, and not all inclusive, like very nuts and bolts, transactional, I would say, this person. So the fifth house is strong um, in a certain way, but I would say overall, probably the strongest houses, I would say, are the third house and the ninth house. Jupiter, I was already talking about, is aspected by its disposer of Venus. That's going to help boost it up. And Mars is going to be in there. So higher education came. And then the fifth house is also father. So even though Sun is debilitated and aspected by these three other malefic, exaggerated malefic planets, I mean, Mercury, combust, Mars, combust, and Rahu, at least this person had a father and potentially a very kind and generous father because Jupiter and Venus, the two benefics, were there in Taurus. So grounded and supportive, especially materially supportive father, we could see. But that was lost early on, pretty early. I mean, 35, and mom, dad, sibling are all gone. And then I would also say sibling was also strong here because you have Venus there and Jupiter as aspect. So you have the two benefics in the third house of sibling. And then with the Parivartana, you have Mars in its own sign. So you have Mars, Swa with Venus and Jupiter. This is also going to be a very, kind and caring and supportive I would say more emotionally supportive because Scorpio is like a water sign. So it looks like father was especially materially supportive, sibling was emotionally supportive, but again, that was all gone by the time they were 35. So yeah, so not on the street, not completely isolated, but um, lost a lot pretty early on. I think in in due in a large way to the Kemadruma here. Okay, so let's keep moving on. Again, just want to give you like a real person's chart so you could see how this goes. All right, so what do we have here? Lunar yoga's interpreted. Okay, so I was just so I was looking mostly. I started off with the Phala Deepika to see what it had to say about lunar yogas, and then I went to the Brihat Parashara Hora BPH chapter 39 because it has a chapter 39 is just about lunar yogas. So it mentioned the four yogas that I've already talked about. Very similarly, it did give like a Leo Simha Lagna example, which I will share with you in just a minute here. Um, but essentially, yeah, the outcomes for those four was essentially the same. So let's just do the the Leo Lugna example that they gave, just to again reiterate that it's not just about the yoga. You got to read it in terms of the context of the whole chart, just like what I did with the last the lawyer's chart. Okay. So let's look at the charts here, though. So we're starting with the Leo Lugna. We look at the top of the diamond here, and there's a 5 in the corner. The 5 represents the fifth zodiac sign, or Leo somehow. Okay. Well, I put Moon in the top here. Now, what are we looking for? So Sunapha, we're looking for true planets to the second house. And for Anapha, we're looking at true planets in the 12th house. And then for was it Dhuradhara yoga? We want planets in both, second and 12th house from the moon. And then Kemadruma, if nothing, none of those, right? So let's just look. Let's just take one benefic, one planet, one true planet, Mercury. Okay. Now the first case scenario is if we have Mercury. So again, in Leo Lugna, if we have Mercury in the second house from the moon, and the moon is in the Lugna, Mercury is going to be Swa in its own sign here. That's going to make Mercury even stronger. So whenever this person runs Mercury, Mercury will probably give a lot. Okay. Again, I've only put in a few here to make it simple, but just so we understand. The other thing to note is in Leo Lugna, Mercury is super important for money because Mercury is the lord of the second house where Virgo sits, and it's the lord of the 11th house of income where Gemini sits. So especially for Leo Lugna, you really want to know like what's going on with Mercury. Because if Mercury's debilitated or combust, that can be a big deal, like a double whammy. It's either going to double people up or double people down in Leo Lugna. So if we have this, Swan Mercury in a positive house, even though again, when I read the initial outcomes associated with Sunapha and Anapha yogas, and the third one as well, they all sounded pretty good, but which one would you think is going to give more during a Mercury Jyotish planetary period? The Mercury in its own sign in the second house, or Mercury in the 12th house where it's in an enemy sign of Cancer, and the 12th house is related to loss. And because Mercury is the lord of the 11th house of income and the second house of assets, I mean, clearly the Mercury in the second house is going to give a lot more than the Mercury in the 12th house in this chart without knowing anything else. Okay. So, yeah. So again, you want to look at this whole thing in context. Yeah. But I thought that was a pretty good example, simple, but pretty good. Okay, so before I was going to talk about the other lunar yogas in the BPH because there were others listed there. But before I do that, I wanted to mention that there are other forms of Kemadruma just to be complete with this. Okay. Now, apparently, these other forms of Kemadruma, and these are fairly new to me, but they make sense. are from the Jataka, Parijata, and this is all mentioned in Phala Deepika again, chapter 6. Okay. So these five listed here, other forms of Kemadruma. Some of them, most of them make sense in a way, but they seem less stringent. Like they seem like they're less, they're like almost too common because, like, let's look at the first one here. So Moon is in the Lagna. Okay, so that's one out of potentially 12 charts. You're going to get Moon in the Lagna, right? Moon in one out of 12 charts. Or the seventh house. So that's one. So the Moon in one out of 6 charts, but not aspected by Jupiter. So, and Jupiter has, right, 3 aspects. Yeah, 3 aspects. So, what is it? One out of 6 times, what is it? 1 out of 4 or something like that. That's not going to be a hard yoga to come by. So I don't know if this is part of the reason why this, and it doesn't have a specific name like Anapha or Sunapha or whatever, but to me, this doesn't seem strong. Like if somebody had this, like you might think, "Oh, okay, well, maybe they don't have as much support, but Kemadruma is like a whole other, deeper, rabbit hole than this. This, you might take note of it, but again, I wouldn't, just based on this, I wouldn't expect somebody to have like, a completely devoid life where they lost everything. Then the second one here, all planets devoid of strength unless Bindus and Ashtaka. Okay, so Ashtaka, that's like a way of determining, because each of the seven planets, not including Rahu and Ketu, because there are 9 classic Jyotish planets, but 7 other planets, when they're in certain positions from each other, they gain strength or they lose, they gain or lose strength. Okay. So basically what you do is you get a chart of these and then you just start counting up, like, where's Jupiter in relationship to the sun and is it strong or weak? And where's Jupiter in relationship to the moon? Is it strong or weak? And then you start counting, like it used to be beads. You used to draw the, back in the day, before software and PowerPoint and stuff, they used to draw birth charts in the sand or whatever, dirt, and then they would put little rocks, little stones, to count how many positive placements there were of Jupiter relative to the other 6 planets, and then like Moon to the other 6 planets, and so on and so on. So you start counting these up. Now nowadays they count them, they call them dots or bindus. And then so if you have a software where you have Ashtaka Varga associated with you, available to you, what that means is when a planet is devoid of strength, like in that lawyer part I gave you. I mean, Sun is debilitated, Mercury's combust, Mars is combusted. Mars is a little bit stronger because it's in Parivartana with Venus and that sort of thing. So if the planets are devoid of strength and less bindus in this Ashtaka Varga analysis, that's going to bring the moon down. Like all those, what would I say? They were all malefic planets. I mean, around that lawyer's chart, but the Sun was exalted next to the moon in the second house, and um, Mars is a swa, like Ketu's there and Saturn's there. So it's gonna, again, it's like the second house and eighth house were pretty much like, very similar, where again you were getting this, somebody, if you rotated the whole chart to where the moon was in Pisces, you were going to get essentially the same thing. Like this person is going to probably over represent themselves, like speak in a very authoritative way, that but underneath I'm not sure that they have the goods to back up what they say. Essentially okay. So if you like to do Ashtaka Varga, maybe the second one is helpful to you. The third one here is, okay, with a night, birth, and fall. And I don't know how they define fall. So I assume that means autumn period, but I don't know how they define autumn. Like, depends where you are in the world, right? And how long is that? Are we talking like autumn equinox to winter solstice, or how does that work? I don't really know. But we're talking about a night birth. And then this is what I also didn't understand. So moon in an enemy's Rashi, which is a constellation or sign, But the way I learned it is that the moon is the one planet who doesn't have any enemies. So I didn't understand this myself. Okay. But okay, just keep reading to see what else is here. Because the thing is, even if you don't use these, it still informs you as to like why are we even looking at the moon and what kinds of things are we looking about the moon? Because that kind of stuff is going to be fairly consistent. Um, so moon and enemies Rashi, which again, how do you define enemies of the moon? I don't know. As far as I've learned it and I've taught it, is that there are no enemies of the moon. So I don't exactly know what that means. Maybe there's something else in the Phala Deepika that's, or the Jataka Parijata, since it comes from the Jataka Parijata, which I don't have a copy of. Maybe in there it defines enemies of the moon differently. Maybe. Or the Navamsha. This is the D9. This is the one of the subdivisional charts or sub-zodiacs. Different names for the same thing. But again, in my training, the moon doesn't have any enemies, so I don't. You'd have to figure out what these moon enemies are to use this one. And aspected by the 10th Lord. So, if you figure out what the moon's enemies are, then maybe that'll be helpful. I don't know. Then the fourth one here, Moon and Scorpio. Okay, so Moon and Scorpio, what does that mean? Scorpio is the debilitation sign of Moon, which is kind of where I started with, right? So Moon and Scorpio, Navamsha, so again, the D9, not just the D1, right? The natal chart, can join with a malefic, so malefic's going to drag it down, aspected by the Lagna Lord. So what that means is, again, you're getting this relationship between the Lagna and the Moon, kind of like what we were doing with qualifying the Kemadruma. Like, are there true planets in the Kendras from the Moon? Are there true planets in Kendras from the Lagna? And then is the Moon in a Kendra from the Lagna? Because when the Moon is in a Kendra from the Lagna, that means that there's some um, workable relationship. Let's put it that way. If the moon is in the sixth house from the Lagna, the moon, the mind, the emotions are in the house of enemies from the Lagna. The mind and the body, so the Lagna you can think of as like the body, the physical self, are going to be at odds with each other. So you can see it that way. Okay. But you can see like moon and Scorpios, a debilitated moon in the Navamsha conjoined with a malefic. Malefic's going to drag it down more. And then the Lagna Lord. So the debilitated moon and the malefic are going to drag down the Lagna as well. This is what that means. Right. And then the fifth one here is moon and Anicca Rashi, which again is a debilitation sign, which is Scorpio for a night birth. So that's also important because a lot of these lugnas, and we'll get into more of them, lunar lugnas, because the moon is so obvious, at night, that's when it's sort of its ruling time. If the moon is new and you can't see it, or the moon is debilitated, like, almost half of the day and night, is there's going to be a negative energy there. Okay, so these are again other forms of Kemadruma, just to tie that up and make sure that we're complete there. Okay, so let's look at the other lunar yogas that BPH talks about. There's 6 more in addition to the first 4 famous ones that I mentioned, and this is from chapter 39, which is titled Lunar Yogas and BPH. So the first set here is the moon and looking at the placement of the sun in relationship with the moon. Okay, so let's talk about that first. So there's 3 categories here. So when the sun is at an angle from the moon, meaning the sun is in house 1, 4, 7, or 10 from the moon, this is called an Adama Yoga. Okay. When this happens, there's a little effects on wealth, intelligence, skill, and vehicles, fame, happiness, education, or generosity. So this is not a very strong yoga, but there's some influence here. Then, if we look at the situation where sun is in Panafara uh, situation with the moon, so this means that the sun is in the 2nd, 5th, 8th, or 11th house from the moon, it's called a Sama Yoga. So this has a middle effect on the things that are mentioned above. So it'll give more when the sun is in these houses versus the previous houses. And the third situation here is when moon is apoklima from the sun, meaning the sun is 3, 6, 9, or 12 houses away from the moon. And this is called a Vrishta Yoga. Now, this will give the most of these three conditions here. Okay. And this is from Phala Deepika, chapter 6, sloka 14 and 18. So let's just look at this little chart on the right here. So again, we have a Leo Lagna. I wanted to keep that the same so we don't switch moon and Lagna at the same time, then it gets too confusing. But the moon here is in the 10th house. And yeah, so where's the sun, right? Just to get at these first ones. Sun is in the 9th house from the moon. So is that the Adama Yoga criteria? No. Is it the Sama Yoga criteria? No. Is it the Vrishta Yoga criteria? Yes, because the sun is 9 houses away from the moon. So this is a Vrishta Yoga. So this would actually have quite positive effects for the native regarding wealth, intelligence, skill, and all these other good things. Okay. So then the second kind of grouping here in green. So now what we're looking at to understand if there's a yoga is we're looking at, is there a day birth or night birth? And is the moon in its own Navamsha, so that's a D3 subzodiac divisional chart, or a friend Navamsha? I don't have the D9 posted here. You'd have to look at that separately. And is the moon aspected by Jupiter during a day birth? Now, for a night birth, the moon is in its own Navamsha or friend Navamsha, meaning it's strong. The moon is strong and aspected by Venus. Then you would also have wealth and happiness here. Okay. So day birth, aspect Jupiter, strong moon, good stuff. Night birth, strong moon, aspect by Venus, good stuff. Now the opposite is true. So if during the day birth, moon is strong, but it's aspected by Venus, potentially you would see a lack of wealth and happiness. And then also, you have the opposite effect of the night birth. If you have a strong moon, night birth, but it's aspected by Jupiter, you would potentially lose wealth and happiness. Okay. So I don't have a D9 here, but we can kind of look, at least on the natal chart. So we have a moon here. Okay, so is this a day birth or night birth? That's the first thing to figure out. Well, this is a night birth. How do we know that? Because the Lagna here is a sign uh, rising at the time of birth. Okay. Um, so this is kind of daybreak. You can kind of see, yeah. So halfway through the Lagna is, kind of morning time. The sun is rising. Yeah. Then halfway through the 7th house, the opposite, this is when the sun is setting. So you have like in these, the time associated with here is like the middle of the Lagna is kind of associated with 6 a.m. And then the middle of the 7th house is related with 6 p.m. So if the sun is past halfway of the Lagna before it hits halfway of the 7th house, then sun is in the sky and shining and it's daytime. Okay. If the sun is past the middle of the 7th house, then the sun has gone beyond the horizon. And so in this chart, this is a night birth. Okay. So let's look at night birth. So night birth and then moon in own Navamsha or friend Navamsha. So I don't have a D9 here, but we're looking at a strong moon. Is this a strong moon? Well, potentially, yeah. I mean, it's a bright moon because the sun is just past, or the moon or it's reaching fullness here. It's going into fullness within probably 3-4 days. So this is a bright moon. It's not a full moon, but it's a bright moon. So the moon is reflecting light from the sun, so that makes it strong. What makes it stronger, though, is that the moon is in Taurus. Because if the Lagna is in Leo, and then we go backwards to Cancer, and then we go backwards to Gemini, and then we go backwards to Taurus, Taurus is the 10th house, and moon is exalted in Taurus. This is a strong moon. Okay. And then is it aspected by Jupiter? Well, yes, it is. Okay. But the thing is, we have a night birth here. So, night birth, strong moon, night birth, yes. Strong moon, yes. Aspected by Jupiter, yes. Okay, we're going to have a negation here of health and wealth and happiness. So even though the sun position from the moon, this first set of criteria gives us a Varishta Yoga where we get some good stuff. The second, kind of grouping here, there might be a diminution of some of these good things like health, wealth, and happiness. So since Jupiter is the sort of big player here in the second grouping, what I would guess in this chart is that when somebody runs like a Jupiter period dasha or antara or bhukti, sub period, they may lose some wealth and happiness potentially. Whereas when this person runs sun periods or dashas or sub periods, there would probably be a lot more coming, in terms of yogas. Yeah. Because we do have yogas here, but again, Jupiter's going to bring it down and Sun's going to bring more good stuff. So, yeah, so that's the first few extra lunar yogas from BPH. Let's look at some more. And again, this is from BPH, so there's a couple other ones that they listed here. So the fifth category here is benefics in the 6th, 7th, 8th houses from the moon. This is called an Adi Yoga. Now, the thing is, you can have Adi Yoga from the Lagna as well. So Adi Yoga is not a very precise term for this yoga. But Adi Yoga is essentially when you've got benefics 6, 7, 8 houses from some, planet or, again, Lagna moon. Okay, so if you have benefics in 6, 7, 8, so again, this is like you can kind of think of this as like a positive power boost because if there's benefics 7th from the moon, that's a direct aspect supporting the moon. If the benefics are in 6 or 8, it's almost like a mirror, like reflecting. So even though the benefics aren't in 2 or 12, if they're in 8, if the benefics are in 8, they're reflecting into the second. If they're in the 6th, they're reflecting the 12th. So it's almost like a reflective mirror type Anapha Sunapha situation, kind of. You can think about it that way. So what happens if somebody has one of these Adi Yogas? Well, they will be a king, minister, army chief. Again, this relates to the planetary strength, so we got to keep all that in mind, the context of the whole chart. Famous in their own or other countries, wealthy, illustrious vehicles, sun, so that's, again, remember, this is like old language here, so back in the day, sons were considered to be more beneficial than daughters. Let's not get into into that today, but that's how it was. A chaste wife, so a faithful spouse. You be influential, have courage, be long lived, have a large family, be victorious over. I mean, wow, that all sounds pretty good, right? So this Adi Yoga sounds pretty desirable. And again, it's in a way, the Adi Yoga is like a reflection of the Anapha, Sunapha, Dhuradhara, things, yogas that we started off with. Okay. And this is coming from Phala Deepika chapter 6, sloka 42. Okay. Then the last kind of category here, so benefics and upachaya bhava from the moon. So the upachaya bhavas are 3, 6, 10, and 11. And this will give a dana yoga. So dana means wealth. Now, there are a lot of dana yogas. So dana yoga here is not a specific term related to what I've written here. There are a lot of dana yogas. This is just one of many wealth yogas. Okay. But so what are we looking for? Benefics. So again, when we're discussing yogas, this is Jupiter, Venus, Mercury. So our Jupiter, Venus, Mercury in 3, 6, 10, or 11 houses from the moon. So if all three of these, Venus, Mercury, Jupiter are in 3, 6, 10, or 11 from the moon, then you get a lot of money. You get the most money here. Okay. If you have two benefics, so maybe Jupiter and Venus or Venus and Mercury in 3, 6, 10, or 11 from the moon, you get, some good stuff here, some money. Not as much as 3, but 2 is good, If you have 1, you'll get something, but it's you're not going to be winning the lottery here. Okay. So again, let's look at my little mock-up chart over here. Again, we have a Leo Lagna, Leo Ascendant. And where's the moon? The moon is here in the 5th house. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the 5th house in a Leo Lagna is going to be Sagittarius or Danu. Okay. So let's go through the first one. Do we have benefics in 6, 7, 8 houses from the moon? Yes, we do. Look at that. It's so nice. So we have Venus in the 6th house from the moon. We have Jupiter in the 7th house from the moon. We have Mercury in the 8th house from the moon. This is an Adi yoga. Okay, so they're going to get all these goodies, be chief of a bunch of stuff, have a large family, a lot of wealth, and be victorious, and yada yada yada. That's like super great. Okay. What about the second one here? Benefics on Upachaya. So we want to look how many of these. So this person has a, if this is a person, they have Adi Yoga from the moon. But what else? What else do I have here? Let's see. Three. Are there any of these? Are any of these three houses from the moon? No. Six houses from the moon? Yes. Venus. 10 houses from the moon? No. 11 houses from. So Venus, will give an extra little, you know, money here to this person, but the main one here is this Adi Yogi. Adi Yoga. I mean, that's like a huge. You can see how much this is going to give. And the thing is that although you have to keep it in mind, right? Because we have a mixed bag here in some ways, because Moon is in Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter is aspecting its own sign. That's going to support the Moon and make it strong, which is great. But remember, we talked about Leo Lagna and Mercury being in the 12th house, and Mercury being the lord of the second house of assets and the 11th house of um, income. There's going to be losses and expenditures due to this. Now, we don't have all the planets here, but um, depending on where other things sit and how these things are all supported, there can be losses here for sure. If things are well placed all around, the 12th house also indicates things like overseas and long distance investments. So it may be that this person is famous abroad or has, property abroad or businesses abroad, or worldwide, so that could be a positive thing. If there's more negative influence on all this stuff, then it might be that at certain times, especially when they run Mercury, that could be like a lot of losses. Whereas like if they run Jupiter, Jupiter's going to support the moon and support the fifth house, and that would probably also give children here. Yeah. So hopefully that was fairly complete as I could do it. And hopefully you've got some simple examples, but also real life examples to help you work through and understand the most famous lunar yogas and some other ones here from the classic texts of Vedic astrology. All right. So as always, I want to thank you for stopping by, listening to one of my talks. All of my teaching videos on the subject of Vedic astrology are my concepts playlist. They can be found there. If you're looking for more famous birth charts, I have a video titled Birth Chart Archive List 2024, where I list all the famous birth charts that I've analyzed on the channel. And the videos you can find them in, because it's not always obvious from the video titles that I've analyzed anything. So, um, if you're interested in personal birth chart readings, I do them live on Zoom, and it's pre-recorded video. You can write email heartlightastro@yahoo.com for more info if that's interesting to you. I do have another YouTube channel on natural medicine where I cover other Vedic arts like Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine, and yoga, as well as other paradigms of medicine like homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. The name of that channel is Nature Source Care, so that's out there too. And as always, thank you so much for all the support that you give my work, yes, all the support you give the channel. So hopefully you found this helpful, useful, and interesting to you as you learn to navigate the energy cycles of your own life. All right, so take care. Namaste.